Of all the senses, sound is perhaps the most mysterious in its connection to memory. A simple melody can transport us across decades. A particular voice can feel like a warm blanket on a cold night. Have you ever heard a voice that feels like coming home? A voice that doesn't shout for your attention, but rather waits patiently for you to lean in and listen? For millions of people around the world, from the dusty back roads of Texas to the rainy streets of London, that voice belonged to a man they called the Gentle Giant. His name was Don Williams. If you were alive and listening to the radio in the 1970s or 80s, you couldn't escape him. His deep, impossibly smooth baritone was a constant, a reassuring presence that promised everything was going to be all right. He gave us songs like Tulsa Time, Amanda, and I Believe in You, ballads so sincere and direct, they felt less like performances and more like conversations with a trusted old friend. He was a superstar, with 17 number-one country hits in the United States and a staggering, almost unbelievable level of fame in Europe. He was, for a time, the quiet king of country music. But that golden era couldn't last forever, and like a slow, gentle fade at the end of a beloved song, his presence in the mainstream dwindled. He didn't crash and burn in a blaze of scandal. He didn't chase trends or change who he was. He just continued being himself, while the world around him grew louder, faster, and more aggressive. How does this happen? How does a man whose voice was a constant companion to millions, a voice that defined an era of warmth and sincerity, simply vanish from the cultural conversation? This is the story of the ballad singer the whole world once listened to, and the deafening silence that followed. This is the story of a national voice that faded from the airwaves, a gentle giant who walked off the stage as quietly as he had walked on. Don Williams was shaped by the stark, windswept plains of West Texas, born on May 27, 1939, in Floydada, a small town defined by grit and simplicity at the tail end of the Great Depression. Life here was about endurance, not flash. Values of hard work and quiet resolve ran deep. These roots wove themselves into Don's character, giving him a steady, unpretentious spirit that would define his music. His childhood was marked by an event that would subtly foreshadow his entire approach to life and performance. A little-known chapter that speaks volumes about his character. At just a year old, Don contracted polio. The disease paralyzed his right arm, and for a terrifying period, his family feared the worst. In an era before widespread vaccination, polio was a specter that haunted every parent. He eventually recovered, but the experience and the long, arduous road back to health left an indelible mark. It instilled in him a deep appreciation for quiet strength over loud proclamation. He learned early that the greatest battles are often fought not on a public stage, but within the silent confines of one's own body and spirit. Music was his mother's gift to him. She taught him his first chords on the guitar, and it became his refuge. In a world of hard labor and uncertainty, music was a predictable source of beauty and order. He didn't dream of stadiums or screaming fans. He just played. He absorbed the sounds around him, the traditional country of the Grand Ole Opry drifting from the radio, the burgeoning rhythm and blues, and the raw emotion of the folk revival that was beginning to bubble up across the nation's college campuses and coffee houses. But music wasn't a career path, not yet. It was a passion. A real job was something you did with your hands. After high school, Don cycled through a series of blue-collar jobs that read like a checklist of American working-class life. He worked in a furniture factory. He drove a bread truck. He even spent a brief, uncomfortable stint as a bill collector, a job so antithetical to his gentle nature that he later admitted he was terrible at it. Often feeling more sympathy for the people he was supposed to be chasing down than for the company he worked for. Through all this, the guitar was his constant companion. He married his high school sweetheart, Joy Bucker, in 1960, a partnership that would become the bedrock of his entire life. They started a family, and life was simple, stable, and decidedly ordinary. But a new sound was sweeping the nation, carried on the airwaves. It was the sound of the folk revival, championed by artists like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary. It was a music of harmony, storytelling, and acoustic honesty. And for Don Williams, it was a sound that felt like home. In the mid-1960s, he teamed up with two other singers, Lofton Klein and Susan Taylor, to form a folk pop group called the Pozo Seco Singers. The name Spanish for dry well was a wry, self-deprecating nod to the stark Texas landscape they came from. It was here that the world got its first taste of Don's voice, not as a lead, but as the foundational baritone harmony that gave the group its rich, warm core. And for a moment, they were a sensation, propelled to fame by their 1966 song, Time. It was a perfect encapsulation of the era's pensive philosophical mood, with intricate harmonies and existential lyrics that made it a surprise pop hit, climbing to number 47 on the Billboard Hot 100. They were on the map. They toured. They recorded albums for Columbia Records. They tasted the strange and intoxicating flavor of fame. But the Pozo Seco Singers were a product of a specific cultural moment, and as the 60s wore on, that moment began to fracture. The gentle folk harmonies were being drowned out by the electric psychedelia of the Summer of Love and the raw anger of protest songs. The band struggled to find its footing in this new landscape. They went through lineup changes, experimented with different sounds, but they could never recapture that initial spark. By 1971, the well had quite literally run dry. The group disbanded, leaving Don Williams, now in his early 30s with a wife and two sons to support, back at square one. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. A brief, shining moment in the music business, followed by a quiet return to a normal life. But Don Williams was not most people. The end of the Pozo Seco Singers wasn't his final chapter, it was his prologue. With the harmonies of the Pozo Seco Singers silenced, Don found himself at a crossroads. He was 32 years old, an age when many in the cutthroat music industry are either established stars or have already given up. He had a family to feed and the bitter taste of a failed band in his mouth. He didn't pack up and go home to Texas. Instead, he drove deeper into the heart of the music machine, Nashville, Tennessee. But he didn't arrive with a guitar in hand, kicking down doors and demanding to be heard. That wasn't his style. He came to Nashville with a different, more humble ambition. He wanted to be a songwriter. He saw himself as a craftsman, not a star. He landed a job as a staff writer for the publishing company owned by the legendary cowboy Jack Clement, a producer and engineer who was one of the architects of the Sun Record sound, having worked with everyone from Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins to Jerry Lee Lewis. This period is one of the most crucial and least discussed parts of the Don Williams story. For months, he sat in a small office day in and day out, simply writing songs. He wasn't performing, he was learning the architecture of a hit. He was honing his ability to tell a complete emotional story in 3 minutes. It was here he learned the power of economy, of saying more with less. He wasn't just writing for himself, he was writing for other artists, trying to capture their voice, their style. This experience forced him to become a master of empathy, a skill that would later define his own music. The plan was to remain behind the scenes. Stardom, with its demands and its artifice, held no appeal for him. But Jack Clement and his business partner Alan Reynolds, another future legendary producer, heard something special in the demo tapes Don was recording of his own songs. It wasn't just the quality of the writing, it was the voice delivering it. That voice, a baritone as smooth as well-worn leather and as comforting as a fireplace, was undeniable. It didn't sound like anyone else in Nashville. It was too calm, too centered, too gentle. They convinced him against his better judgment to record a few songs for himself. It was a gamble. In the early 1970s, country music was in a state of flux. You had the slick, string-laden countrypolitan sound on one end, and the burgeoning, gritty outlaw movement of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson on the other. Don Williams fit into neither category. He wasn't slick, and he certainly wasn't an outlaw. He was something else entirely. In 1972, he signed with Clement's JMI Records. His first single, Don't You Believe, barely made a ripple, but his second release in 1973, a song he wrote called The Shelter of Your Eyes, began to turn heads. It climbed to number 14 on the country charts. People were intrigued. Who was this guy? Then came the album, Don Williams Volume 1, and with it, a persona was born, though it was less a persona and more an authentic extension of the man himself. He appeared on stage and on album covers in a simple, unpretentious uniform, a denim jacket, a plain shirt, and his signature wide-brimmed hat pulled down low, casting a shadow over his eyes. He didn't strut or swagger. In fact, he often looked deeply uncomfortable in the spotlight. His most famous stage props were born not from a marketing meeting, but from genuine anxiety. He felt awkward and exposed standing on stage, so he brought a stool with him. He'd sit down, prop one foot on a rung, and create his own little island of calm amidst the glare of the lights. Beside the stool, he'd place a coffee mug. It wasn't an affectation, it was a comfort object. It gave him something to do with his hands, a familiar ritual in an unfamiliar world. The man on stage was the same man who'd driven a bread truck in Texas, just with a guitar in his hands and a microphone in front of his face. The world dubbed him the Gentle Giant, and the name stuck because it was true. He was a tall, imposing figure, but his music and his demeanor were the essence of gentleness. In 1974, he released I Wouldn't Want to Live If You Didn't Love Me, and it shot straight to number 1 on the country charts. It was the first of a tidal wave of hits that would define the next decade. The songs were a revelation in their simplicity. Working closely with producer Alan Reynolds, Don crafted a sound that was the polar opposite of Nashville's lavish productions. They stripped everything back. The arrangements were sparse, often just an acoustic guitar, a subtle bass line, a soft shuffled drum, and maybe a touch of steel guitar or a gentle string section. The star of the show was always the song itself, and above all, Don's voice. His voice was the anchor. It never strained, it never shouted. It was a conversational baritone that wrapped itself around the listener. It conveyed a profound sense of intimacy, making you feel like he was singing directly to you, sharing a secret or a quiet truth. He sang of love not with the fiery passion of a whirlwind romance, but with the steady, enduring warmth of a long-term commitment. Songs like You're My Best Friend, Some Broken Hearts Never Mend, and the iconic Amanda, a poignant ballad about a man reflecting on his life, and the woman who stood by him through his rambling ways, resonated deeply with an audience tired of drama and artifice. Amanda, written by the brilliant songwriter Bob McDill, is a perfect case study. It had been recorded by other artists, but it became Don's signature song because his delivery perfectly captured the song's weary, loving resignation. When he sang the line, Amanda, light of my life, fate should have made you a gentleman's wife, you could feel the weight of 1,000 nights spent on the road, the quiet guilt and the overwhelming gratitude all in one breath. The hits kept coming. a steady, reliable stream of warmth and sincerity. Tulsa Time, a more upbeat, shuffling number, became a crossover smash, its laid-back groove irresistible. Good Old Boys Like Me, another MacDill masterpiece, was a masterful piece of storytelling, a nostalgic look at a Southern upbringing that felt both specific and universal. Then in 1981 came I Believe in You. This song was perhaps the purest distillation of the Don Williams philosophy. In a world full of cynicism and doubt, it was an unabashedly positive and sincere declaration of faith, not in grand institutions or ideologies, but in the simple, everyday goodness of people. I don't believe in superstars, organic food, or foreign cars, but I believe in you. It was a country song that became a global anthem of reassurance, hitting number one on the country charts and crossing over to the pop charts in the U.S. and beyond. And beyond is a key word here, because while Don Williams was a country superstar in America, he was a pop culture phenomenon in places you might never expect. The gentle giant from Floydada, Texas, was about to become an international obsession. While Don Williams was steadily conquering the American country charts, something strange and wonderful was happening across the Atlantic. His music, so deeply rooted in the American South, found a second home in the hearts of listeners in Great Britain. This wasn't a slow trickle of interest, it was a full-blown love affair. The British public, often stereotyped as reserved and cynical, fell completely for Don's unabashed sincerity. In a music scene dominated by punk rock's angry energy and the theatrical glamour of new wave, his gentle, straightforward style was a radical act of quiet. He was the antithesis of Johnny Rotten or David Bowie. He offered not rebellion or fantasy, but comfort and a kind of grounded, masculine tenderness that was in short supply. His albums consistently charted higher in the UK than many mainstream pop acts. In 1976, his Visions album hit the top 20 on the UK pop album charts. In 1980, a compilation album, The Very Best of Don Williams, went to number 1. Not the country charts, the main album chart. He was outselling British rock bands in their own backyard. His tours of the UK were massive sellout events held in arenas like the Royal Albert Hall, venues typically reserved for rock royalty and classical virtuosos. A fascinating part of his appeal was how his image was interpreted. To American audiences, his denim and cowboy hat were familiar signifiers of a country artist. To British and European audiences, they were symbols of a romantic, idealized America. He wasn't a country singer to them. He was an American troubadour, a figure straight out of a classic Western, but one who sang of love instead of gunfights. He represented a kind of steadfast, gentle integrity that they associated with the best of the American spirit. The connection was so strong that Eric Clapton, one of Britain's most revered guitar gods, recorded a cover of Tulsa Time for his 1978 album, Backless. It became a top 40 hit for Clapton, further cementing Don's songwriting credentials and introducing his sound to a rock audience that might have otherwise missed him. But the reach of his voice didn't stop in Europe. In one of the more surreal chapters of music history, Don Williams became a massive star in Africa, particularly in Kenya and Nigeria. His ballads, with their clear, simple melodies and universal themes of love, loss, and family, transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. In the 1980s, it was said you couldn't walk through a market in Nairobi without hearing "You're My Best Friend" or "I Believe in You" drifting from a vendor's radio. His music became the soundtrack to a generation, a strange and beautiful piece of cultural cross-pollination. Through all this global success, Don remained resolutely unchanged. Fame was something that happened to him, not something he pursued. He was notoriously private, a man who cherished his quiet life on his farm outside Nashville, with his wife and 2 sons far more than any gold record or sold-out arena. This is where we begin to see the profound emotional core of the man. He was, in many ways, a reluctant star. He gave very few interviews, and when he did, they were often short, polite, and revealed little of his inner turmoil. He preferred to let his songs do the talking. Yet in those rare moments of candor, a consistent theme emerged: his discomfort with the celebrity part of his job. "I never have been a real social person," he once admitted. "I was always a little shy. I just don't think I was cut out to be a star." Think about the profound contradiction here. Here is a man whose voice brought comfort and a sense of intimacy to millions, yet who himself felt anxious and exposed in public. The stage stool and the coffee mug were not just props, they were his armor. They were his way of carving out a small piece of private, normal life in the most public of settings. He built a career on a foundation of approachability, yet he was by nature a solitary man. His loyalty was not to the industry, but to his family and his small, trusted circle. His 57-year marriage to his wife, Joy, was the anchor of his life. While other stars of his era were living out the rock and roll cliches of divorce and drama, Don's greatest love story was the one he lived quietly, off stage. This devotion was the unspoken truth behind his greatest ballads. When he sang about enduring love, it wasn't a fantasy, it was his lived reality. He wasn't playing a character, he was just being Don. There's a beautiful, rarely told story that encapsulates this perfectly. For years, he toured with the same band, treating them less like employees and more like an extended family. After one particularly long and grueling tour, the band members were exhausted. Don quietly arranged for all of them, along with their spouses, to take an all-expenses-paid vacation to Hawaii. He didn't issue a press release or seek any credit for it. It was simply a gesture of gratitude from a man who understood the value of loyalty and rest. But the gentle, steady rhythm that Don Williams had established couldn't last forever. The music industry, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and it is in a constant state of evolution. As the 1980s drew to a close, a new sound was brewing in Nashville. It was younger, more energetic, and it was about to change the landscape of country music forever. The gentle giant, who had stood so tall for so long, was about to be overshadowed by a new generation of titans. It's rare for a figure as beloved and successful as Don Williams to have a section dedicated to controversy, because in the traditional sense, there was none. He was a man of impeccable character, devoid of the scandals that plagued so many of his contemporaries. There were no public meltdowns, no substance abuse stories, no messy divorces. His life was as clean and straightforward as his music. The controversy, then, is not one of personal failings, but of historical and artistic debate. It revolves around the very qualities that made him famous, his simplicity and his gentle nature. And it helps explain the paradox of his later career, how a man so universally loved could become so culturally sidelined. The first debate is an artistic one. Was his style too simple? During his heyday in the 70s and early 80s, his minimalist approach was a breath of fresh air. It was a stark contrast to the often overproduced Nashville sound. But as time went on, some critics began to see this consistency not as a virtue, but as a limitation. They argued that his albums, while always pleasant, became predictable. The tempos were often similar, the arrangements spare to a fault, the emotional palette confined to shades of warmth and gentle melancholy. He existed in a strange space, separate from the major artistic movements of his time. He wasn't a part of the outlaw movement, While Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings were kicking against the Nashville establishment with grit and swagger, Don Williams was quietly doing his own thing. He wasn't rebelling, he was simply being. To some, this made him a unique and authentic voice. To others, it made him seem passive, lacking the edge and complexity that gives an artist long-term critical endurance. He never released his Red-Headed Stranger or his Honky Tonk Heroes, those landmark concept-driven albums that redefined the genre. He just released Don Williams albums, each one a collection of beautifully crafted, heartfelt songs that sounded, well, a lot like the last one. This leads to the second, more significant historical debate. Was his gentle brand of masculinity ultimately too passive to survive the changing tides of country music? In the 1970s, his persona as the quiet, devoted family man was a powerful alternative to the hard-living cowboy archetype. But by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the ground shifted dramatically. The class of '89, Garth Brooks, Clint Black, Alan Jackson, and Travis Tritt burst onto the scene, and with them came a new energy. This wasn't your father's country music. It was high-octane, theatrical, and tailor-made for stadiums. Garth Brooks, in particular, was a force of nature. He didn't sit on a stool with a coffee mug. He ran across the stage, smashed guitars, and swung from ropes, borrowing the energy of a 1970s rock show and injecting it directly into country. The sound changed too. The production became bigger, glossier, with roaring electric guitars and thunderous drums. The lyrical themes, while still touching on love and life, were often delivered with a new level of showmanship and bravado. In this new era of hat acts and arena country, Don Williams' quiet contemplation started to seem less like a feature and more like a bug. His style wasn't just different, it began to feel dated. Radio programmers, always chasing the next big thing, slowly began to phase him out in favor of the newer, louder artists. He didn't fight it. He made no attempt to adapt his sound to the new trends. There was no Don Williams' 90s rock album. He would have seen such a move as a betrayal of his own identity and of the audience that had supported him for so long. As he once famously said, "The only thing that's ever been a concern to me is the music. It's a pretty simple and naive approach, but it's just the way it is." So, he continued to make the same beautiful, heartfelt music he always had, but the audience for it on mainstream radio was shrinking. It wasn't a sudden fall from grace, it was a slow, inexorable tide going out. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of quiet sincerity, and now the world was clamoring for a carnival. The gentle giant stood his ground, but the ground itself was eroding beneath his feet. This wasn't a failure on his part, but a reflection of a fundamental shift in cultural tastes. The very thing that had made him a star, his unwavering gentleness, was now the reason he was being left behind. The historical debate, then, is whether he was a timeless artist who fell out of fashion, or a product of his time whose time had simply passed. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The long-term impact of Don Williams is as subtle and profound as his music. He didn't change the world with political anthems or revolutionize the industry with technical innovations. His legacy is quieter, more personal, and woven into the very fabric of everyday life for millions. It is a legacy of emotion, influence, and the quiet defense of a different kind of strength. His most immediate consequence was the creation of a new archetype in country music. Before him, masculinity in the genre was largely defined by two poles: the lonesome, rambling cowboy or the rowdy, hard-drinking good old boy. Don Williams presented a third option: the gentle, steadfast family man. He made decency and devotion not just acceptable but aspirational. He proved that a man could be strong without being loud, This gentle giant archetype was his unique contribution, opening a door for other artists to explore a more sensitive, introspective side of the male experience. His influence can be heard in the generations that followed. Anytime a contemporary artist opts for a warmer, more understated vocal delivery, they are walking a path that Don Williams paved. His DNA is present in the work of artists who prioritize musicality and sincerity over bombast and spectacle. Keith Urban himself has been effusive in his praise, stating, "I don't know anyone who doesn't love Don Williams' voice. He's a master of the less is more school of singing and playing." Perhaps his most significant cultural impact, however, lies in the emotional space his music occupied. For his fans, he wasn't just an entertainer, he was a companion. His voice was a source of solace, a constant presence during life's most significant moments. People fell in love to his songs, got married to them, and found comfort in them during times of grief. As one fan aptly put it, listening to Don Williams is like having a conversation with your own heart. He just says the things you're already feeling but can't find the words for. He didn't sell escapism, he sold validation. The final chapter of his story is a poignant reflection of his entire life. After his chart success waned, he continued to tour for his fiercely loyal fan base. He announced a farewell tour, only to return a few years later with 2 critically acclaimed albums. He officially retired for good in 2016, walking away from the spotlight with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. His passing in 2017 was the final act of his lifelong preference for the understated, a quiet closing chord to a magnificent song. In a world that is noisier and more performative than ever, his music stands as a monument to the power of quiet sincerity. He reminds us that you don't have to shout to be heard. He was not the thunder of the storm, he was the shelter from the rain. And while storms pass, the need for a gentle voice in a noisy world never truly fades away.